I'm Executive Director of Export New Zealand, and it's fantastic to welcome you here today. I'm just going to do a little bit of health and safety, and we're live streaming this, so this is going all around New Zealand, but I'll cover off who's on the other end in a minute. So just the health and safety for those of you in the room. Bathrooms, when facing the elevator doors, the men's bathroom is to the left and the ladies' bathroom is to the right. General evacuation procedures. In case of an emergency, please follow the directions of the Business New Zealand staff. If you need to vacate the building, please make your way down the nearest stairwell located in the corridors on either side of the lifts. Both stairwell doors have an exit sign on them. Please make your way down the stairwell to the ground floor and meet on the left of the main entrance doors of Jackson Stone House in front of Miko Shoes. In the event of an earthquake, drop, cover, hold. Remain in the building until the earthquake has passed and you will receive directions from the Business New Zealand staff when it's safe to exit the building. Right, we've got that out of the way. I have a Wi-Fi password here, but I'm not going to give it to you because you're all going to be riveted on our speakers, so you don't need it. Okay, so look, it's just a pleasure to be here. This is a sort of a cut-down event. Normally at this time of the year, Export New Zealand would be running our annual conference called Go Global. It's a huge day. It's a big full-on day with full-on speakers and full-on tech, and it's really fantastic. Normally we hold it in Auckland. So this is really, we obviously couldn't do it this year, but, we've got some incredible things happening in the world. We've got this confluence of unusual events out there. So I think it's really great to get some good speakers in the room to talk about things that our exporters care about. So I'd like to welcome everyone, and I'd just like to give a shout out to our export regions around the country. So as I said, we're streaming this, and we've got exporters meeting in our local offices, and some of them to listen to our speakers and then have a bit of a networking event afterwards, which is what we're doing here as well. So a shout out to our regions in Auckland, Waikato, Bay of Plenty, Hawke's Bay, Manawatu, Wellington, Christchurch and Dunedin. So I hope you all enjoy it and get some good value out of these speakers. I'd like to acknowledge we've got lots of representatives here from our embassies and high commissioners in the room, so welcome to you all. And a big thanks to New Zealand Trade and Enterprise and Ministry of Foreign Affairs and Trade for their support for the event, as I said, in place of Go Global. And a big thanks to Business Central, who run Export New Zealand Wellington, and in particular Ferg Grenfell, who I'm sure a lot of you exporters know. I think he's probably out still manning the desk, but he does an awesome job. And right, as I said, we're living in strange times. We've got COVID-19 that everybody's been dealing with. We've got Brexit. We've got the USA elections. We've got tariff wars. We've got protectionism. We've got closed borders in New Zealand, and we've got extremely expensive and challenging logistics and freight issues going on at the moment. So our speakers are going to all cover different angles of this, and we thank them for being here. And we're going to kick off with Vangelis Vitalis, who's Deputy Secretary for Trade and Economic at Ministry of Foreign Affairs and Trade. I'm sure a lot of you have heard him before. He's a great speaker, so I'm looking forward to it. He's also the APEC 2021 Senior Officials Meeting Chair for New Zealand's host year and Chief Negotiator for Free Trade Agreement with the European Union. Vangelis will discuss where we are with our FTAs, what the geopolitical risks are out there and the opportunities, and how overseas posts are helping exporters. So please join me in welcoming Vangelis.
Thank you very much, and very nice to see many familiar faces, which is really good, and to the people live streaming as well. There's a really good opportunity to reflect a little bit on what lies ahead for us. So what I thought I would do first is give you a bit of a feel for how we're trying to think about the next sort of 2 or 3 years, what that context looked like, and in particular what some of the big emerging themes are going to be. And then second, I want to talk very specifically about our trade recovery strategy, and in particular draw your attention to these contact details here that I'm going to speak very specifically about. I want to leave you with the thought that yes, it is going to be a challenging international trade policy environment for us out there over the next, I think at least the next 2 to 3 years. But there is a strategy to manage that. There is a strategy to mitigate as far as possible as many of the risks as we can for New Zealand exporters out there. And in particular, I want to leave you with the thought that, it's one of those tedious jokes, the government really is here to help you, but this time we actually mean it. And we do have, yes, I thought that would get a little chuckle. I can imagine what people in the regions are thinking. But look, let me start by sketching a little bit of the context and perhaps what the big emerging themes are going to be out there for us as we look out there. Look, the first and the most obvious thing to say is that we are facing and we are in the midst of an enormous global economic shock. And the distinguishing feature of this economic shock, of course, is it's a combination of a demand-side shock, but also a supply-side shock. That has very big implications for our exporting prospects because it affects price, it affects demand, it affects our supply lines, it affects the inputs that go into exports, because please don't forget, as exporters, you do need imports to come into New Zealand to help add the value that you then project out into the exports that you are trading internationally. So that first big emerging theme is how do we manage this global economic shock? And we all know the numbers from the World Trade Organization and elsewhere that have predicted very significant falls in global trade, 13 to 32%. Those were projections. It's clearly not been as bad as that. I say not been as bad as that yet. In New Zealand, the decline for us in exports has been around just under 10%, around 8%. That's a pretty good outcome, and it's a pretty sad thing to say that we think an 8% decline in exports is actually a good outcome. But given what we were facing and some of the very serious challenges that we could foresee in March and April of this year, actually an 8% decline is, I hate to say it, is not a bad outcome at all. And in fact, there are pockets of, particularly for our primary industries, there have been pockets of significant growths and new opportunity. But for many of the manufacturing sectors and some of the other parts of the primary industries around wood, fresh lobster and some of the high-end products that we produce, things have been very, very difficult indeed, and there have been some significant declines. So as an aggregate observation, there is clearly still a very big challenge ahead of us in terms of picking up that export number. The second big theme that I see emerging out there is essentially uncertainty. In particular, the uncertainty that we have around COVID. So we don't know, is the European Union going to go again into a lockdown? We're already seeing, of course, in Belgium and London and Spain that they have gone into lockdown. Will that in France? Will that continue through December, January? What will that do in terms of demand? Well, we do know it suppresses demand. What will it look like on the other side of winter? What's going to happen in the United States and in the Americas more generally, where lockdowns have been progressive? They're not quite the lockdowns that we had here in New Zealand, which was a very complete lockdown, but that rolling lockdown, we're still trying to understand what exactly that's doing both to demand, but also, don't forget, in terms of supply as well. The situation in India, one of the big drivers of growth in the region, and of course, how China then manages the situation, given its importance to the global economy as well. So you take all those pieces together, and that level of uncertainty, which of course business and exporters really struggle with, because it is the kind of thing you don't know how you're going to price in, market effects, and some of the challenges that you're going to face out there. How should you be thinking about those? Now, this is where we can help, and I want to speak in the second part of my presentation about how specifically we might help you. So that second theme of uncertainty, the COVID, look, the other thing that we're really concerned about is the way in which our international trade rules are starting to fragment. That's not just a story around the World Trade Organization, though that is clearly an emerging, it is a present challenge. but we're also trying to think about what it means for all of our network of free trade agreements that are out there, and the need with some urgencies to sustain and support those. We also have uncertainty. We don't know what the US-China relationship, so fundamentally important for international trade, what is that going to look like? We also don't know what the US-EU relationship is going to look like. So we do know that the EU has been given the right by the World Trade Organization to impose some additional tariffs on the United States as a consequence of the Boeing Airbus case. We don't know how the United States might react to that. We don't even know when the European Union will exercise its legal right to do that. So again, uncertainty. Then, of course, there's Brexit. Very important to New Zealand exporters to think about that, both in terms of their relationship with London, but also their relationship with the continent itself. So again, more uncertainty. Are the EU and the UK going to be able to strike a deal? What kind of deal is that going to look like? And what does that mean for our own opportunities in two very important markets for New Zealand? Then there's the question of supply lines, the resilience of New Zealand's supply lines. What do they look like? Are we confident that they are in good shape and in good order, that we can see ourselves through, or is there some work to be done? And we are doing work precisely on the strategic resilience of our supply chains and thinking about what kinds of things we should be thinking about to ensure that security and certainty of supply that becomes very important to us in a whole range of areas, ranging from medicines through to PPE equipment, but right through to the packaging that you need to export your product internationally. And the final bit of uncertainty that I am a bit worried about is public confidence. Public confidence in trade and in imports. I am starting to get anxious about some of the things we're hearing from a number of markets, both in North Asia, but also in Europe and also in the United States. Anxiety about purchasing foreign food that may have COVID infections and so on it. So scientifically not correct, but nevertheless you can see a public perception, and that starts to feed into, well, I don't want to be buying this food because I'm not sure it's safe, and I just need a reassurance around the COVID protections around that. So you can see that rising uncertainty, that will feed into the willingness of governments to move forward more on trade, because of course trade is supposed to open up markets and increase exports and imports, and you can see that public uncertainty might well feed into some greater anxiety, as if we needed it, in terms of trade policy. Look, the third area, so it's the global shock, it's the uncertainty, it's protectionism rising, is the third area that I am very concerned about. So we are seeing evidence of people increasing barriers against a range of products, right through from rice through to PPE equipment. That will rapidly feed on itself as people conclude that actually this is working pretty well. I'm going to protect my market. I'm going to make sure that I can produce all the face masks that I need domestically, and I'm going to raise the tariff on that to make sure that my domestic producer has the space to make those productions. Of course, not thinking about the fact that if COVID-19 shuts down the factories that are making those face masks, where will you then get those face masks if you're not prepared to import them from some other country? So again, it's my point about resilience. How do you think about that resilience? And we're seeing evidence of people then looking to step in and support stressed sectors. So we see US farmers receiving multi-billion-dollar packages of support. We've just seen the European Union do the same to their farmers. It's a wonderful world if you've got deep pockets, but it does present new challenges, I think, to New Zealand exporters as they think about the way the world looks. My fourth kind of big theme that I see out there is the continuing absence of leadership from the major economies out there in trade policy. This is a non-trivial change that's been underway for the last 3 to 4 years. And we had got used to nearly a quarter of a century where the major economies were willing to work together. They did have a shared understanding that the multilateral rules-based system delivered benefits to them all. That understanding has been shaken, and I would argue has fractured now, and we are now missing that large country leadership, and there's clearly a vacuum that's now emerged, and one that we're going to need to think very hard about in terms of our own work that we're going to be doing as we look forward. Let me now turn to the New Zealand Trade Recovery Strategy. So nearly 2.5 months ago, Ministers Parker and Minister Mahuta came together to launch the New Zealand Trade Recovery Strategy, and it's in three parts. The first part is it's the three R's: the retooling of exporter support, the reinvigoration of our international connectivity, which is essentially about our trade architecture, so the reinvigoration of that, and the refreshing of our international commercial bilateral relationships. So those three R's are the framework through which the government's trade recovery strategy is being run. And in particular, this is a story of NZ Inc. agencies working better and more coherently. It's really nice to see you, Rachel, because you'll be speaking straight after me to put it all in context, because we are working very closely together with NZTE as a key partner of ours in driving that trade recovery strategy, but also MPI, MB, Customs. So all of our colleagues are working together to drive the support that we believe that New Zealand exporters need and deserve in what is clearly a challenging time. So specifically, what are we doing? Well, up here you can see. Let me draw your attention first of all to our market intelligence reports, free reports, crisp, clear 1 to 2 page reports on particular markets. There's a contact point there. You read a report and you think you want more information, tell us. We have an embassy network out there that is keen to help to provide more detail and more information. All you need to do is tell us. So for those that are on in the regions, it's exports@mfat.net. That is your key contact point. We will respond to you within 2 working days, and we will find you either solutions or task our embassy network out there to deliver you the kind of reports that you would find most useful, and then they will be put up also on the website. There are now more than 100 market intelligence reports out there. The second very important element is a very practical, how can we help you? If you've got a problem in an international market, you need to tell us. Don't sit out there and fester that no one's helping you. Come and tell us. We'll be very honest and upfront with you whether we can help you, but we are going to think in a very strategic sense, how do we deploy our network? Which of our international partners might we work with? Do we have a common problem here together with Chile, say, or the European Union in market X? Can we lean in together? At what point do we deploy our ambassadors to go in? At what point should we be thinking about using the institutional frameworks provided by the international treaties that we have in place with many partners? There are a number of options that we can deploy to help you in very practical ways if you are running into difficulties. So the trade barriers website is an absolutely crucial resource. Try us out. We have members of the trade recovery team here. I'm going to get Hunter to stand up, but there are other members of the team. Actually, they might all stand up as well. Be nice to Anjali as well. Thank you. Sam? He may not directly in the team, but look, these are the people. Am I missing anyone?
No, they're not here. They're working on trade recovery.
Excellent. Right. Yes. In fact, what are you doing? Here, Hunter? But in all seriousness, these are the people that are. We are really serious about helping. We know that businesses can't travel. We know you can't look after your clients offshore in the normal way that you would do. So we are saying that our embassy network is there to help. So if you've got a client that you want to go and visit, that you want to have the embassy call on to make sure that you keep those relationships going, it's right down to that level of practical detail that we are very, very keen to assist. Just ask. As I said, we will not be diplomatic in our response because we actually want to be really clear with you about what we can and what we can't do, and we don't want to waste your time. So this is going to be a very important test for us, and by us I don't just mean MFAT, I also mean NZTE, that we actually deliver to you. And then you will find that there are a number of very practical tools here, like the tariff finder that we've got, and we're hoping soon to add to that a services finder. So if you're a services exporter or a goods exporter, you'll be able to find detailed information about the free trade agreements that are out there and what preferences and advantages you might enjoy in those agreements. So these are very helpful tools that you should use, but there's an 0800 number, there's the exports@mfat.net number. That's our first big offering. It's the retooling of exporter support, and we are really committed to making that work. We've got a clear instruction from the government that that's a priority, so you should expect from us really top-notch service. If you don't get it, this is Hunter's warning, just write to me, and we'll make sure you do get a very quick response. Right, Hunter? That's the way that works. So my name is Vangelis.Vitalis, and then it's @mfat.govt.nz. And I am very approachable, and I do respond very quickly to emails, and I'm very, very committed indeed to making this exporter support program that we've got in place together with our colleagues from other agencies, particularly NZTE, to actually work. Look, the second and third areas I just want to touch on very briefly, the reconnecting, or rather the reinvigoration of our international connections. That's essentially about our negotiating agenda. So this is a country that has weak international connections. So the OECD tells us that more than half of our weak productivity figures are accounted for by our very weak international connections. This was before COVID. This was before the air links that we have internationally essentially have withered away. So we have a real challenge ahead of us in terms of reinvigorating all of those international connections, and trade agreements will be an important functional part of driving this economy's integration back into both the Asia-Pacific region, but more generally as well. And on the agenda there is, of course, the EU FTA, so our most important partner at the moment, with which we don't have a preference, we don't have any advantages in that market. So if you're selling honey, 17% tariff that you're facing, your competitors are at 0. So if you're shipping onions, 9%. If you're shipping, what's a good example? If you're shipping kiwi fruit's my usual example, but I don't want to use that one here. Look, there are a range of tariffs in place that these agreements will knock down to try to level the playing field for you. And the same goes for our other important partner, the United Kingdom. The other major economy with which we do not have a preference at the moment, our second most important market with which we don't have a free trade agreement is, of course, the United States, and I know Leon will be speaking about that separately. But that's another interesting dimension of the relationship that we need to be thinking about. Look, as part of our international connectivity, we do have a very significant opportunity next year. We are hosting APEC. As you know, we're hosting it virtually. This is a real opportunity for New Zealand, number one, to show leadership, to raise our standing and status in the region as a responsible player in this important institution, APEC, which kind of is the ecosystem through which you support the rules-based system that for exporters is really important in terms of delivering certainty and transparency around actual rules that do deliver to your bottom line. So APEC is a really big opportunity, and you'll see the government and ministers and the Prime Minister really leaning into that as an opportunity for us to kind of project our way of thinking into the wider world. And my final observation is the reinvigoration of our international bilateral relationships. You'll already have seen that the Prime Minister, in one of her very first speeches since she was elected, re-elected I should say, that she said that she wants to travel, and she named a number of destinations, and we're thinking already about how that's going to work and at what point we want to be doing that. But also, of course, we're not thinking just of the Prime Minister to do that travel, but also our other ministers as well, because it is going to be very important that we have a presence internationally and that we are actively seen out there championing the interests of exporters. That is, after all, a crucial part of this trade recovery story that we are very determined to deliver for you. So look, I'm going to stop there. I hope I've given you a bit of a sense of, yes, it is a challenging environment out there. It is going to be hard. The global economic shock is considerable. My own view, as a sort of economist, is that there is going to be a lag, and we have not yet seen the worst of the impact. So I think it is going to get really even harder than we've had it. And I think we forget a little bit in New Zealand, you know, these kinds of events that we're having right now, that would be impossible in almost every other country that you can think of. And we should not forget some of those challenges that are out there, and that there is going to be a lag effect in terms of how that feeds back into both demand and prices. But I hope you've got a sense too that there is a plan to deal with this, that there is actually a recovery strategy well underway, that there are real live people working on this, and you've seen some of them today. You should quiz them, you should press them for work, because that is what our job is, isn't it, guys?
Thanks.
Thank you very much.
Now, don't go away. We might make a
Sorry, I spoke too much.
No, you're good. Any questions from the floor? Yep, down there.
First question. So hi, my name's Andy. I'm the CEO and founder of Bridgeshield. So we do cyber security.
Yep.
So for us, exporting is all about digital exports. So there's no tariffs or barriers for us. And in fact, with the world moving online at the moment, it's busier than ever. So I guess, so everything you talk about is very physical based. So what's sort of your and NFAT's approach on promoting New Zealand's digital export economy? Because there's a real space for it to grow right now.
So that's a really good example. So look, I'd make two observations about that. First of all, a big priority for us in APEC is around the digital rules. So there are a whole range of issues that you do need to be thinking about if you're a digital exporter of services, as you are. Where do you keep your data? What are the rules for that? So at the moment, the rules are being made up as we go along. And I think the really interesting thing is that there is a fragmentation of the rules that exist out there. So CPTPP was one attempt to have some partial rules in place to govern some of the things, where do you keep your data? What kind of data sovereignty provisions should there be in an agreement? What right does the government have to make sure that the data you have, that I'm getting the full amount of tax out of you? Those kinds of very challenging questions. There are no actual international rules that are fully covering the wide range of this, and that's probably in part because the digital sphere is moving so fast. APEC is one opportunity where we are thinking about some of the guidelines that we might agree, so to try to, in a gentle way, prod governments in the direction of making sure that there's the right balance between, citizens' privacy, commercial confidence information, but also the free flow of business. So that's one element. But a very practical one that New Zealand, Singapore and Chile have done is to negotiate the Digital Economy Partnership Agreement. So this is it's available online, so mfat.govt.nz/deeper. It's backslash or forward slash. You'll find it.
He's a digital guy.
You're a digital, exactly, yeah. So the Digital Economy Partnership Agreement, so that's the first, we believe it's the first international trade treaty that was signed virtually. So that's quite cool. Well, I think it is. But very importantly, it builds on the existing set of rules, and it was designed, and it's a living agreement. So we're actually be very interested to hear from you a little bit more once you've had a chance to look at the agreement. Okay, what more should we be doing? Because the idea is that this agreement will evolve. The point of the agreement was 3 small countries trying to reflect the views of our tech sector rather than have the rules imposed on us by the Amazons, the Alibaba and others in the world who've got particular views on a whole set of digital issues that may or may not suit small countries like ours. So this was an attempt by us to construct a vehicle in the Asia Pacific that says, here's some rules that we think work really well for us. And what we're trying to do now is we're trying to attract other countries to join that agreement. So we're looking to, we're talking to the UK about it. I expect we've already talked to the United States about it. We'll continue to talk to the United States about it. It's an open accession agreement, so any country can join it. But it's our attempt to put some order and some actual rules around the kinds of activity that you do, but in a positive way, to try to give you certainty and transparency around the actions that you are or the trade that you're engaged in.
Great question. Thanks, Vangelis. Thank you. I think we'll just leave it there because we've got a few speakers to get through. But great question because, we can sometimes in these discussions sound like we're all about goods. And, of course, we're all about everything. So that was really good. So next we have Rachel Baxter, who leads New Zealand Trade and Enterprises People and Capability Team and is responsible for design and execution of NZTE's people strategy, ensuring we have the global culture, leadership and capability needed to have the biggest possible impact on growing companies internationally. NZTE also has an additional $200 million from the government to put towards exporter support. So this was all part of the COVID recovery. So they have some additional money there, and Rachel's going to outline how that's been spent and what sort of new support is available. Welcome.
That's all right. Tēnā koutou. Ko Rachel Baxter aho, transformation lead at Te Tūrapa Tūhono. So currently actually on a secondment from the People and Capability role as part of a project we set up as a result of that additional budget funding to think about, how do we deliver more value for more exporters. So like everyone here, our world has been dominated by COVID. So back, I think it was January, I was leading our P&C team and we established our COVID response team at that point. Started off very much focused on the wellbeing of our people in China before kind of, chaos ensued and COVID took over everywhere. So what are the challenges we've seen with our companies? And, you've touched on a lot of the themes already. Borders, a huge issue. Many of our companies are fly in, fly out in terms of the markets they're targeting, kind of regardless of what type of business that they are in. Digital has been the key theme. Our digital service was one of our least utilised pre-COVID. We've been completely slammed in terms of demand since, not surprisingly, and really, I suppose, accelerated companies thinking about how do I sell digitally, and companies are pivoting their business models as a result. Certainly capital funding has been a real constraint for a number of the companies that we're working with, and supply chains have been touched on as well, originally very much starting around air freight and more recently moving to sea freight in terms of the challenge. At the same time, there's huge opportunities. We are seen as COVID-free or quasi-COVID-free, and that presents a big opportunity for us, particularly in that kind of food beverage space. The storytelling, we are seen as safe, and that provides an advantage. And digital has been a huge leveller for a bunch of our companies. And, Andy, we're seeing more of our tech companies thriving rather than surviving, much more so than, our manufacturing companies in the food and beverage space. So it has presented a real opportunity for a number of our companies as well. And the opportunity to really position New Zealand, the goods and services we're selling from a sustainability perspective as well. So, as Catherine mentioned, we were privileged enough to receive additional funding through budget as part of the government's overall trade recovery strategy. The majority of this goes straight out the door through to companies as we are co-investing in growth projects for them, so $30 million a year extra in that space. And we've really been looking to say, how do we provide more impact for more exporters over this time? So, what we've done. So in June, we had 700 companies in our focus portfolio. These are the companies that we have a dedicated team wrapped around, that have access to growth funding, that we are co-funding capability support alongside. That's now at 1,500, so we've had a pretty quick migration of companies into the portfolio. We've hired 55 new people as a result, primarily offshore. And one thing that's been quite interesting to see with COVID and with these new companies coming into the portfolio, we're seeing real demand in 3 markets. So Australia, US, China. We're seeing huge scale there. And the US in particular has been interesting given the political dynamics that have been going on there, but really, really big demand. So our team's been scaling up quite a lot in that space. We got into the business of air freight, which was not something we ever thought we would do. So we were chartering planes left, right and centre, helping customers get goods to market. We've since really moved that more into supply chain help. So helping companies to understand what are the opportunities or what are the risks in their supply chain. The additional International Growth Fund I mentioned, $30 million more. Government's also changed some of the parameters around that. So previously, company would invest 60 cents into a growth project. Government would invest 40 cents. That's been brought down to 50-50. Just wanting to de-risk some of these projects for companies. We've also enabled companies to come back more frequently for projects. Like you all know, everything has gone online, so quite a lot of thirst for webinars from our in-market teams, people really kind of hungry to know what is happening on the ground. And we've recently put out the Made with Care program, which is really around how do we attract preference for New Zealand food and beverage products, which again we're targeting in premium markets and joining up with some of our NZ agencies on that. So that's been a bit of the last 8 months. So in terms of what our people are seeing offshore, so similar themes as I've mentioned already, still digital. How do you connect with customers, selling with customers, B2C, B2B, doesn't matter kind of what business you're in. It's been huge. We're seeing virtual trade shows. Food, still a big issue globally. So some of it you touched on as well around there's demand for food, healthy food, premium markets. You've got places like the Middle East that are really concerned about food security, so that's a huge opportunity. The demand for tech solutions, particularly in niches, is hot. And our teams are saying our reputation is at an all-time high. So how do we really leverage that as a country? Supply chains, like I mentioned, the anxiety is still there. Sea freight at the moment is the main area of concern. And investment's really complex. So we're seeing quite a lot of M&A activity. The government's changed some of the rules here just to stop purchasing of distressed assets. And investors aren't used to investing virtually. They want to come and see the shop floor of what they're potentially investing into. So that's been a challenge as well. I think we've had a couple of deals now that have been conducted wholly virtually, but that was very much a leap of faith there. And the overall comment at the bottom, pattern is there is no pattern. So it really depends on what markets you're targeting. It depends on the nature of the business that you're in, who you're selling to, and what the local situation is. How big is protectionism? How big is buy local in the particular area that you're in? And saying that, despite the uncertainty, we're also positive. We've seen movement in terms of the number of or the proportion of companies we're working with that are more optimistic now than they were in July across all areas, but still definitely a challenge ahead. To the point that you made, Mangili, about events not happening like this elsewhere in the world, this is what our international network looks like. The red dots are people who are working from home. So about 80% of our officers are still working from home and are likely to be doing so for the foreseeable future. If one of our people the other day said, I've been at home for 8 months, 24 hours a day with 3 teenage boys and I'm in a small apartment. It's hard yakka. We're worried about the resilience of our people. It's something we're quite conscious of at the moment. And in saying that, for a lot of those people, work has been the really positive highlight. It's given them attention and focus and purpose, and they've been really keen to do all that they can to help companies grow. It's been interesting times from a people perspective. Those 55 people, the vast majority have never met their team, so we've virtually recruited them, onboarded them, inducted them, so they're looking forward to the day where they finally get to meet some of their teammates. So we've also been quite focused on this productivity commission gap. How do we bring New Zealand closer to the world, essentially? 3 main parts we're thinking of in terms of a future focus for us. We're going after a reach play now, so we have been quite focused as an organisation on those focus customers, those ones that have a dedicated team wrapped around them. So we're really now saying actually there's a much broader group of exporters there that we're wanting to provide value to. They will primarily be serviced digitally, so MyNZTE, our personalised platform to serve up some of that content, serve up those kind of practical things. Encourage you to check it out if you haven't already. And for us, part of that too is how do we productise a bunch of the knowledge? We know that our people are doing kind of repeatable work, particularly in that market selection, market entry space. So we're really going after that reach piece. We've put a GM responsible dedicated for it. It's the first time we've done that, and wanting to think about how do we really use the reach of the regional business partner network amongst that as well. We've definitely got some smarter ways of working, things that we can do internally, how we lift our own people up the value chain so they can spend more time on the things that really matter for companies. Connections in market is something that our people hugely value, so we're really wanting to lift our people up so they can spend more time on that high value work. And then on our intensity play, that more value for focused customers, we are thinking about how do we provide more practical implementation support in market, not necessarily delivered by us, but actually curating that kind of broader network of advisors, experts that our companies can use. So it's both a reach and intensity play for us over the next period as well. But yeah, like you said as well, we're very much here to help. We're here to, we exist to grow companies offshore. So please get in touch with your customer manager or check out my NZTE, and if there's anything we can do, feel free to reach out to me as well. Thank you.
Thank you. Stay there for a minute.
Sure.
That was really good. Great to see all the new bits and pieces, because it's a bit of a changing scene at the moment. So it's good that exporters are able to see what the opportunities are. Has anyone got any questions from the floor? Yep, Josie, you've got one from online.
It's what help can NZTE provide to New Zealand companies with global marketing, as the world's e-marketing has been flooded? So what's new?
So just in case people online didn't hear that, e-marketing, what kind of help can we get with e-marketing? Because everybody's doing it and it's a very crowded space.
I think two answers to that. So yes, we've got a bunch of services in that space in New Zealand where we can help as well. And depending on what country you're in, is sometimes I would say in-market support is more specific. So, we've got people in the US that are, I can think of a honey company, for example, where they need specific help around selling on Amazon. We need to deliver that in market, not delivered from New Zealand. So I think depends what your specific needs are, but absolutely, we've been running kind of webinars, we've been doing one-on-one support for companies specifically on that topic. So if you've got a customer manager, reach out to them. If not, rachel.baxter@nzte.gov.nz, put you in touch with the right people. But yes, there is a lot out there, crowded market.
Great. Any other questions from the room? I guess I've got one question, and that's it's great to see the focus group has essentially doubled in size, or has the potential to double in size. If you think you're a business that should be in that group, how do you go about getting into that group? What's the criteria? What do they need to do?
So we've got some pretty set criteria which are on our website. So again, we're looking for hunger and ambition for growth. We're looking for capability and some capacity to at your end, because we very much view it as a partnership around it. So again, details are on our website, or feel free to reach out to me. One thing I didn't mention before, but we are thinking around that as well, around preference for Māori companies, companies focused on sustainability, and our female-founded companies, of which we have very few currently in the focus portfolio. So it's on our website.
Cool. Oh yeah, we've got a question down there.
So James Clippers from Onions New Zealand. You touched on shipping and how it's going to be an issue coming forward. We've got a bit of a plan ahead. There's a lot of shipping companies that are not looking to invest in bringing essentially empty containers to New Zealand in the near future. So we're going to have a bit of a potential shortage coming up over the next 12 months, and that's going to be a bit of a shame if the goods aren't able to get offshore, I guess, into the market. So it's a bit of a heads up, I guess, but also something we need to start thinking about. How do we get these containers back into New Zealand?
Yeah, cool. So I think the key thing that we've been trying to do is gather insights. What we need is real life examples of where it is occurring, and then kind of our role is to go and lobby Ministry of Transport, go and lobby government to see what can be done around it. But it's interesting that we're hearing the same theme come through from multiple sources. So happy to have a conversation about that one. Yeah.
Thank you. That was great. Thank you so much. And of course, Export New Zealand have an advocacy role as well. So we're definitely getting lots of businesses saying that the shipping and logistics is a problem. So we're passing all that through to government agencies as well. And also happy to partner more with NZTE to give, to boost the support for our export community. So we're talking to them about that. Okay, our next speaker is Leon Grice. He's the chair of the NZ-US Council and previously was Ministry of Foreign Affairs and Trade Consul General in LA. where I know from experience, because I've been on a trade mission to Washington with Leon, his Rolodex of contacts in the tech sector, particularly in the United States, is second to none. Very well connected. So Leon will give us an analysis of what the US presidential election result will mean for business in the USA and for exporters to the USA. So welcome, Leon. Looking forward to it.
Thanks, Catherine. Kia ora tātou. I'm a US political junkie, so I'll cover briefly the election and how to think about the election result, from my perspective at least, and then cover what we could expect from a Biden administration, what that means for New Zealand. And there's some other issues that have been raised around the digital export and Vangeli's comments before about deeper and digital rules, which I think are really going to be important going forward in the next few years. So, what can we expect from a Biden administration? The list includes COVID, climate change, trade, multilateral institutions, security in our region, and great power relations. The thing that I going back to that election night, it was an incredible, Scott Brown said it, it was an incredible display, a celebration of democracy. They fought hard to increase the turnout and they got it. The Trump campaign increased the popular vote from 63 million 4 years ago to 71 million. That's 8 million more votes. And the Biden-Harris campaign increased the Democrat popular vote from 66 million to over 75.6 million. So 8 million and 10 million respectively. 65% of Americans turned out. It's tended to be around the 55, 57%. So the turnout, it was incredible. And you sort of can understand for President Trump why he's struggling with the result, because he would have hit and exceeded all of his targets. And you would have seen that through the night, him actually hitting the targets that they were aiming for. And so there's no doubt it's a bitter disappointment. But I think on the few days ago, President-elect Biden's victory speech, it was pitched perfectly. He called for America to come together and that his presidency will be about unity. And he said, for all those who voted for President Trump, I understand the disappointment tonight. I've lost a couple of times myself, but now let's give each other a chance. So I think he's very perfectly reached out to the 71 million voters that voted for Trump. And I'll go later on why I think that's important. It suits politicians, but I'll go to it now. It suits politicians and the media to use hyperbole to describe the elections in every country. Evidently, most of our television coverage would start about a bitter election, a divided country, a more partisan election than ever. And I think that those are incredibly unhelpful words for describing democracies, and they're misleading. It suits politicians to do it because it whips and motivates their supporters with iconoclastic statements, and the same dynamic sells newspapers and wins advertising dollars. Our own state-funded broadcaster, a leading current affairs reporter, on the first day of his arrival in DC, took a field trip to West Virginia to a gun store to find the most cartoonish depiction of rural support for President Trump. Now, how do you think we would feel if a foreign news team went to Mataura to find out what the people of New Zealand think? Find the supporters. We would be deeply insulted. It's a nonsense, and the fact that our taxpayers' dollars funded that trip didn't advance any understanding of the United States in this country at all. It just doesn't help at all, which is, it's the largest, most cohesive federal democratic system in the world. It is 50 countries, and unless you've lived there, I was privileged to live there for 5 years, 2012 to 2017. People would say, what did you think about the States, or what do you think about it? And it was a very simple thing, it is big. And you don't really understand how viscerally big it is a continent, and it is 50 countries, 50 different cultures, and they do have enormous powers, the states, and they're held together by a federal election. It's an incredible democracy. So it was worth celebrating that it is an incredible democracy. The other thing that I think has come out is some of the conservative commentators are talking about the future of the Republican Party after the election and saying that they're going to have to pivot to become the working class party. So Latinos and African Americans turned out for Trump higher than people anticipated. Now, Biden got a lot of support amongst Latinos. There are many different kinds of Latinos. That's the other thing too. There are very many different kinds. There's Cuban Latinos, there's the Southwest Latinos. So it's very difficult to characterize. In fact, it's racist to characterize them as having one particular set of views. And so, but in terms of those ethnic group as a cluster, Trump did well amongst African Americans, and he did obviously quite well in the Rust Belt. Now, Bengali's an economist. I'm not. I'm an historian. I arrived in the United States in 2012. When they've been printing money for about 4 years, and the asset bubble was just getting going in the coastal cities of the United States. And so there was a lot of regulation, but so you can't build houses, you print money, interest rates go down, and everybody gets rich, except for the Rust Belt, where the incomes are more there's layoffs, the banks don't want to lend to people, and so the quantitative easing leaves those people behind. And so in some ways, when you look back at his historian, you'd have to say it's kind of predictable that they turned out for Trump. And the 71 million people still feel left behind, so that is an issue that's going to have to be dealt with in that democracy. We just started our printing presses earlier this year, so we'll see how that turns out. But I would make the point that while racism and systemic racism is an issue, an undeniable issue in the United States, of course we have segregation here in New Zealand as well. We just need to drive 30 minutes up the road to see how segregated our society is too. And that was one of my reflections on coming back. So there is racism, so I'm not denying that. But the 71 million voters do not want to be characterised as racists. Those are people who feel that the system is rigged and it has left them behind. So there's a challenge there for Joe Biden to bring them back in, and his speech indicated that he is going to try and be the president for all those people. So let's go back to what the New Zealand interest and the list of topics at the beginning. I think Team Biden is totally going to focus on their problems domestically. COVID-19, there's 120,000 people per day getting it. There's 1,000 people a day dying from it. It's increasing. That's his first priority. He's formed a task force immediately to address it. So in terms of foreign policy and security, those are not unimportant, but he's going to be very domestically focused in the short term, by the short term for at least the next year. And in some ways, that's actually very good for New Zealand. I think that a Biden administration and an Ardern administration will find that they will be natural partners and they will have lots of common ground. And that's going to be important for New Zealand in terms of COVID-19. It's no surprise that it is an American business, Pfizer, that is going to be probably the first one to deliver a vaccine into New Zealand. And we've shown, and I think MFAT, credit to MFAT, and also MB have managed to get a strategy together to make sure that we are getting access to that. And also in the United States, there's a lot of research coming out on treatment and therapeutics and testing as well, because we're going to have to clearly live with this vaccine for at least the next year. And so I think that, the Prime Minister Ardern in her first call, she'll probably be asking, as will other leaders, asking President Biden to join COVAX and how we distribute the vaccines and how we work together and share science and the like. So I think that will probably be the first agenda on the call first thing on the agenda between Biden and Ardern. And then I think the other thing in terms of is that he'll be very focused on an inclusive economy and an inclusive democracy. Covered that. I think the other thing for us at the moment as the NZ-US Council is COVID-19 is having it's a two-sided coin. On one side, we do a deep dive, and you can see it on the NZ-US Council website, into two-way trade, and it held up in September. The trade between China was impacted much more. So it was more resilient trade, and I think that reflects the kinds of things that we're selling and the kinds of, whether it's digital or services or goods. And so it actually is a very positive trading relationship. We don't have an FTA with it, but we have growth in that relationship and have done every year for the last decade. So, and I think, we've seen Rachel talked about demand from companies to do more in the United States. That has been a consistent theme for well over a decade. We need an FTA with the United States for a bunch of reasons, but it doesn't mean, like in other markets, that if you don't have an FTA, it's going to be more difficult. It actually is a relatively open economy for New Zealand exporters. So there's that. On the other side of it, there are very serious costs. I talked to 3 immigration advisors, the 3 largest, yesterday, and $2.8 billion is sitting at the border because we will not allow our investors to come in, investor migrants, and they can't apply, they can't get their visas processed, and it probably would be 3/4 of that money would be coming from the United States. And US investor migrants are the most active. They want to invest in companies like Red Shield. They want to invest in companies like FaceMe and Avatars. They want to invest in property development. They want to bring new technologies to New Zealand. There are people who are industrious. They want to be part of our society. That is having a massive cost, and I don't know how long we can really continue without that having a major impact on our productivity. And we'll be looking for MFAT to carry that into the advice to ministers that are coming in soon. On climate change, our administrations will be aligned. He will rejoin the Paris Agreement. He's more committed to he is committed to multilateralism, whereas President Trump didn't seem to respect it. He's campaigned on banning fracking on federal lands. He's talking about stopping the Keystone XL pipeline from going ahead. He set a goal of 100% clean energy economy and net zero emissions by 2050. So there's no reason why the Prime Minister can't work with the United States and the administration to achieve New Zealand's goals alongside them. The one area where I think there could be some tension is I think that he's not going to want to go back into Paris without a reward, and one of that will be that China increases its commitments, which some people perceive them to be quite modest, and so that may put some tension in the region around whether or not China supports the United States to come back into the agreement. So that will be, I think, an aspect of the new competition between the United States and China. On trade and FTA, I've put 2 words. We've got to be realistic and we've got to be optimistic. But, Scott Brown and Rosemary Banks and the team up in Washington, D.C., no one thought that we would get an immigration law passed in the last Congress, and the Kiwi Act was passed. And that took a lot of coordination here from the embassy here, our embassy over in DC, and a lot of hard work went into that. So the idea that these things are impossible, what looks impossible, is not impossible. It's just hard and requires a lot of hard work and never giving up. So you've got to be optimistic. I think there's a really good report out. University of Auckland have just done it, which is about the support of how policies encouraging governments to support the growth of an innovation economy. I'll give you 2 examples of the shift in terms of there's companies that are pure digital, like Shield, but Fonterra's just signed an IP agreement with Land O'Lakes to sell heavy cranes. It's intellectual property. They're selling them the manufacturing processes. So in their own way, they're moving to weightless economic exports. Zespri itself is one of the largest exporters of digital rights, which is the plant variety right. For all of the different varieties that they've got and control that in the Northern Hemisphere. So New Zealand's goods exporters are also shifting into the weightless economy. Those stories just keep accelerating. Shut me down if I'm going too long, Catherine. I think a US trade representative is to be appointed that won't be run by US Steel like the last one. I think that they'll be more looking for compromise to revive the WTO. The problem was the US had a position and it wasn't prepared to compromise on it. Neither was Europe. So we're going to need to reform the WTO. New Zealand trade negotiators, as Vangelis will tell us, agree with a lot of the reforms that the US wanted. Not all of them, but they did agree with a lot of them. So there is a lot of compromise to be done to breathe life back into the WTO. So the pressure will go on Europe and China to actually look at how they accept a series of reforms to get the WTO functioning again. I think Prime Minister Ardern has a lot to do, and I think very high credibility in the United States, very high brand awareness. And she can help President Biden to guide him on how she turned TPP into CPTPP and solve some progressive politics issues. Vangelis asked before, do you think it's a first term or a second term? Because his guess is as good as mine, and my guess is a guess. I think the United States foreign policy strategy has one big hole, and it doesn't have, which is without CPTPP, it doesn't have an economic strategy in Asia. And so if he's serious about China and competing with China, he didn't use the word adversary, he said competition, which is a much better word to use, because it's rather than casting them as the enemy. But I think if he's serious about competing, and Washington is serious about competing, all the think tanks, it's a bipartisan issue, then he needs an economic strategy in the Asia Pacific, and so that and CPTPP is the obvious one, and so it could be sooner, it could be this first term or the second term. The thing that'll slow it down, of course, is those domestic issues. But I do know that the Brits have been tweeting recently about the successful conclusion of round 2 with Vangelis, and for an FTA, but they pitched it as a stepping stone to admission into CPTPP. So there is a pathway that's been outlined for a Biden administration. The other thing too, I have heard from my traps in DC and some of the political people who are connected politically, that there is potentially a trade approach to trade which preferences friends and partners and allies, and that would include New Zealand. So how that plays out, I think it's just a very early idea that goes into the brainstorming for a new administration. But I think that could become a real possibility relatively soon. I'll go back. I've got 2 minutes because I'll go back to the Shield, Red Shield question on digital. Facebook, Google, and Twitter, they're all going to get regulated. You know, it's increasingly likely that those big tech companies are going to get regulated. Privacy is going to be absolutely crucial. How you hold the data on individuals and privacy, how you ship that data across borders, all those rules are becoming more and more important. The rights of intellectual property holders, the content holders, the newspapers, how those big platforms use that data. I know that Scott Morrison in Australia is very focused on that. So is Washington, DC. Deep is there. It's a clever move, but where DC, where the Senate, where the Congress, where the House gets to with the President on those issues will have a big impact on all New Zealand digital providers or exporters. And so that's a good reason why you should join the NZUS Council as well as Export New Zealand. Any questions?
On that note, any questions? Leon.
How do you feel the difference between now and the 20th of January, given that Trump is digging his heels in like a little toddler, throwing his toys out the pram, saying, "I'm going to go," holding onto the desk as he gets dragged out of the White House? What's your view on how that transition is actually going to occur?
Well, the US is a country of laws, and you have to go into a court. It's a post-Enlightenment era where you need evidence and reason that we live in, and so there hasn't been a single case that hasn't been thrown out. I think that they'd have to find systemic vote rigging. That doesn't happen. I mean, we have hundreds of misvotes and the odd 1 or 2 fraudulent votes in our election, and I would expect there'd be that proportion in the US election that would keep it alive. I think it provides him with a narrative to leave saving face, and more he's talking about 2024. So the more that he talks about 2024, I think the die is cast.
Great. Okay. Well, Leon, we'll hope you be around for a
Well.
mix and mingle, so you can tackle Leon. Those of you who can stay for a networking afterwards. But thank you, Leon. Right, last but not least, we have Phil Turner, who is the MFAT ambassador in South Korea, and previously he was a senior executive at Fonterra. Phil is a good friend of Export New Zealand. He served on our advisory board, and he was called away by the Korean president, I think, to a meeting. So he couldn't be here live, but he has done a pre-record. And we do have Trade Commissioner Stephen Blair on the line to answer any questions at the end of the session. So let's hit go and let's hope this all works beautifully.
Kia ora tātou. It's a great pleasure to join you all at the Export New Zealand conference from here in Seoul. Now, if you have to be somewhere offshore during a pandemic, actually South Korea is a pretty good place to be. Korea is doing pretty well, as I say, in both managing COVID and, not coincidentally, in managing the economy. They've managed to keep the pandemic under reasonable control and without resort to lockdowns and without closing the borders. Now, look, the main points I want to run through with you today are, first of all, that while tourism and education have been badly hit here in Korea, the picture for New Zealand exporters in most sectors is surprisingly positive, particularly in areas like F&B. In addition, we have the opportunity to benefit from certain trends in the government's response, such as the Build Back Better and Greener, like sustainability area, the power of online sales, and opportunities in untapped sales, that's with no physical contact. The New Zealand brand here is stronger, I think, than it's ever been before. Natural, safe, high quality, a well-run country. So while Korea, in sum, is not an easy market necessarily for New Zealand exporters, it remains a sizable, growing, and increasingly a trend-setting market for our exporters. So let's take that apart bit by bit, starting with the management of COVID-19 here in Korea. In short, they've done a pretty good job. Since February, there have been in total fewer than 500 deaths. Korea, along with some other parts of East Asia, such as Taiwan, Hong Kong, Vietnam, is seen as one of the most effective governments in the world at dealing with the pandemic. As I say, all this has been done without lockdowns and without closing the border. Travelling to Korea is limited, but possible. Korea has worked pretty hard throughout this to maintain access for, at least for essential travellers, particularly business and official travel. So, for example, for New Zealand, they have suspended the 90-day visa waiver scheme. So New Zealanders do need a visa to travel here. And once you're here, you will need to self-isolate or quarantine at your own expense for 2 weeks. Now, Korea has managed this so well, principally through what they call the 3 T's, effective tracing, tracking, and treatment. In tracing and tracking, they made pretty impressive use of the technology for which Korea is well known, through using phone data, payment data, CCTV, GPS, and so on. With regard to treatment, Korea is well known for having one of the best medical infrastructures in the world. The quality of their equipment and of their medical staff is first rate. So given all that, life today in Seoul is pretty normal. You log in using a QR code at restaurants and shops. You wear a mask pretty well everywhere, including inside the office often, but all shops, restaurants and businesses remain open. Large gatherings are still carefully controlled, and there's still a fair bit of anxiety. So people are still spending a lot of time at home and avoiding others. That, of course, results in a huge increase in online shopping. But within Korea itself, people are moving around relatively freely and spending their money. Now, the way that New Zealand has also dealt with the COVID has really helped us here too. New Zealand was already well known, as you'd appreciate, as a source of natural, safe and high quality products, particularly in F&B and primary products. Now that reputation has been significantly enhanced by our record in COVID management. I think New Zealand has won considerable respect around the world for the way we have governed the country during the crisis. And I think, honestly, this has been helped by the extremely strong personal brand of the Prime Minister herself. So overall, I think here in Korea, New Zealand's brand, reputation and profile have probably never been as high as they are today. Now, turning to the state of the Korean economy, that too is in reasonable shape. Thanks to massive government support and a bounce back in exports in the last quarter, Korea has posted a 1.9% growth rate in Q3, and they're on track to record a minus 1% growth rate for the whole of 2020. Now, while that's still negative, as you can appreciate, that is considerably better than any other country in the OECD, including New Zealand. It looks like a V-shaped recovery here. In addition, the government's response to COVID is itself creating some interesting structural changes and trends that could benefit us. The government has announced two major policies, a focus on the digital economy, which will include looking at things like the Internet of Things, AI, and a Green New Deal, which will include a focus on energy, hydrogen, and clean tech. This focus on building back better and greener is pretty interesting and has opportunities for New Zealand. Now, just 2 weeks ago, the government announced a commitment to achieving net carbon zero by 2050, a big step for a country like Korea. This is expected to drive a lot of investment in green technologies, and already we see Korea playing a leading role in areas like hydrogen, electric cars, and battery storage. So what might the impact be of all this on New Zealand business? Well, overall, COVID, it continues to be a mixed bag for us. Honestly, bad for us in tourism and education, but good for food and beverage and online sales. Now, total trade between Korea and New Zealand is standing at about $5 billion. That includes services trade, mostly education and tourism, which frankly is going to disappear, largely disappear this year. Goods exports, however, have held up remarkably well. They've grown by over 1% in the last year, reaching about 1.7 billion New Zealand dollars. And that's despite the fact that timber, our largest single export category, has been in long-term decline for some time, and that is continuing. But it's offset by growth in other areas, particularly food and beverage. F&B exports to Korea this year alone are up 8% year on year. And if you look back to 2015, since the FTA was implemented with Korea, our F&B exports are up by 2/3. Within that, dairy stands out as a strong performer. Consumption of dairy alone in Korea now outstrips consumption of rice, a remarkable turnaround for this country. What's more, in dairy, we're seeing a shift away from straightforward ingredients to more customized, higher value products, such as protein products for sports, nutritional products for older women, and so on. Meat exports are doing well, with nearly 20% increase year on year this year. Kiwi fruit is also having a stellar time, reaching new highs in the year, up 20% in value, 10% in volume. Now, kiwi fruit is one product that is actually benefiting somewhat from COVID, particularly among middle-aged consumers. They really appreciate the kiwi fruit, the perceived health benefits of kiwi fruit, and relate them to immunity. I've also seen some interesting innovation in the way that kiwi fruit's being sold. Just down the road at convenience stores, we're now seeing kiwi fruit individually wrapped for easy purchase by singles. New Zealand wine and beer, another success story. Wine sales this year are up 25%, still a low base, and New Zealand beer, from an even lower base, is showing explosive growth. Now, like kiwi fruit, some other healthy natural products are getting even more of a premium than they used to. And I'm thinking products like Manuka honey, deer velvet, green mussels. These are all products which have a health claim or claim to be good for your immunity or some other health function. Online retail sales, as you can imagine, are surging as a result of COVID. Now, we see this in particular in increased demand for products like health supplements and home meal replacements, as more and more Koreans just stay home to eat. Now, several New Zealand exporters of food and beverage have had considerable success selling on Korean e-commerce websites sites such as Kupang and Market Curley. Some New Zealand exporters have even sold their stocks out completely, and I'm thinking in particular of a beverage company that recently launched a new range of fruit teas in Korea. There are also emerging opportunities, particularly online, for what the Koreans call untact. That's demand for services without contact, without physical contact. Now, this trend can be reflected in things like pack sizes, product formulation, and distribution channels, always aiming at convenience, speed, and home delivery. And it's not all about food and beverage. The Kiwi Chamber of Commerce did a great job last year in bringing to Korea a tech roadshow, bringing several New Zealand startups to Korea for business development and potential partnership. They're doing a follow-up version online entirely this month, which we are supporting. And there's some great success stories in that space. One I particularly like is Ormio. This is an Auckland-based company which has already sold and delivered to Sejong City, south of Seoul, to autonomous vehicles for the Sejong City network. Now, this is a New Zealand startup competing with some of the best IT technology in the world in Korea. Less positively, as I mentioned, education and tourism are having a hard time. Korean demand for education has taken a big hit, as you would imagine, but there continue to be signs of persistent, ongoing or underlying demand for education in New Zealand. Before COVID, Korea was New Zealand's fourth largest country source for international students and was the highest per capita source among all of our competitors. Tourism, too, remains in a bad way. We had more than 80,000 Koreans visit New Zealand in 2019. Obviously, this year, that's falling away very sharply. Now, Air New Zealand only began services here late in 2019. They were obliged to suspend regular scheduled services between Auckland and Seoul in March this year due to COVID. But both Korean Airlines and Air New Zealand have subsequently relaunched regular passenger services between the two cities. There are also indirect services still through the likes of Narita, Hong Kong, Singapore. And of course, freight is continuing strongly. Sea freight, we've never had a problem here. Air freight, there are now at least weekly regular air freight services direct to Seoul. So although the price of air freight has gone up, as you would imagine, if you're trying to get your product into market by air or sea, there is no problem at the moment. Right, so given these risks and opportunities, what can we do to help New Zealand exporters? Well, here at the Embassy in Seoul, we are very privileged to have the full range of New Zealand agencies represented. In addition to MFAT and Defence, we have New Zealand Trade and Enterprise, Education New Zealand, and Tourism New Zealand. The NZTE office is led by Trade Commissioner Stephen Blair, who tells me that there's been a noticeable increase in demand for NZTE services here in the Korean market. Since July alone, Stephen says, NZTE have had 51 companies who are new to the NZTE network in Seoul make inquiries about export opportunities or to further develop their business in Korea. Now, these companies are from many sectors: food and beverage, manufacturing, technology, services, tech. And they've chosen Korea for several reasons. Are looking to diversify away from China, seeking an alternative Asian market. Others have seen that the Korean economy is doing relatively well and see it as part of their overall export growth plan. There have also been a number of cases where Korean partners have proactively sought out potential New Zealand partners through web searches. So that speaks to the value of having a strong digital online presence for your business. Now, NZTE, for their part, are doing a great job of supporting New Zealand exporters that are unable to travel to develop their business here. NZTE is about using know-how and know-who, knowing who to help and working with exporters to develop the value proposition relevant to the Korean market. They can help develop market entry and expansion strategies. They can identify potential partners and agents in market. They can provide advice and support to New Zealand businesses with buyers and key decision makers. Overall, market entry here in Korea is difficult, but not impossible. NZTE can support companies who usually rely on face-to-face business development by providing virtual opportunities and representing businesses for them on the ground here. In general, NZTE's advice to businesses is to start with making your product or service made for Korea. So what problem are you trying to solve? How does your product or service work for Korean consumers? NZTE can really help with understanding consumer perceptions or end user requests. Finally, just let me point out that under the FTA, we are actually able to bring up to 200 Koreans into New Zealand to work for up to 3 years. Now, the categories are limited, but they do include some interesting areas such as multimedia designers, film animators, biomedical engineers, food technologists, and software engineers. Now, I'll stop here, but just to recap my key message, with both Korea and New Zealand doing a good job in managing COVID, Korea remains a sizable, exciting, and increasingly important market for New Zealand exporters. Our brand is strong, and many firms.
That's great. Thank you. Thanks, Phil. That was really fascinating, and I'm sure there's going to be a lot of exporters around the country, if they're not already in Korea, thinking about Korea. I have had the privilege to go there, and it's a fantastic country, amazing food, and very well-paid people, so good consumers there. So now we do have Stephen Blair online. So if anybody has any questions that Stephen can answer, now would be a good time. Any on the line, Josie? Any questions? Maybe, shall I risk a question, Stephen? And say, how do you work out the best channel for your product or service, and can you help with that for exporters, particularly the ones that are new to the country and might not know who those partners are? You're on mute, Stephen. And look, digital doesn't always work perfectly, so actually getting a pre-record was a pretty good strategy, I think. Okay, look, let's not worry. I think that Phil covered it very well, and he obviously was talking to Stephen and the team at NZTE. So that was a pretty good presentation. So, look, with that, it's up to me to say thank you so much to everybody who took some time out of your busy days to come along and to hear our speakers. Thank you to all the ExportNZ team around New Zealand and all the NZTE team around New Zealand who've come together to listen and to network. I hope you enjoy the networking for those of you that are together in groups. We might as well take every opportunity. We're very privileged in New Zealand to be able to do that, and we sort of forget everybody else is working from home around the world, and it's a lot more grim. So here's to keeping on. The overall stats are pretty good, according to Vangelis, so that's a tribute to all of you exporters. And thanks to NZT and MFAT for their support for these events. And we will go to some networking and some hospitality here in Wellington, and I hope you do in your region as well. So thank you all so much, and a big hand for our speakers. And before we rush for the drinks and nibbles table, I'd just like to acknowledge Patricia Forsyth, who's the High Commissioner for the Australian High Commission. Fantastic you could be here. I know a lot of Kiwis export to Australia. So Patricia is a great person to know. And she also comes from an advocacy and business background similar to Business New Zealand. So we understand each other very well, and she's a great person to know and to deal with. So don't hesitate to go and give her your card. All right, thank you.